Hi, welcome back to the London Conference 2020. I'm Kate Spiliopoulos, Head of Events. As a reminder, if you're tweeting about the event tonight or anything about the conference this week, use the hashtag LUNCONF20, that's LONCONF 20. And if you're in the Zoom webinar with us this evening, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's a box at the bottom right menu for Q&A for anything you'd like to ask our speakers this evening. So in 2011, the Centre for London organized what was then the first ever London Policy Conference. And one of the most acclaimed speakers that year was Janette Sadik-Khan, New York's Transport Tsar. And anyone who's interested in active transport in cities has followed her career and read her book, Street Smart. We're so pleased to welcome her back tonight, alongside another former New York City transport leader and current Commissioner of Transport for London, Andy Byford. Yet another former New Yorker, Tiffany Lam, will be chairing the session for us later on. But for now, we're going to hear a few words of introduction from Alistair Moss from the Corporation of the City of London. Welcome, Alastair.
Thanks so much, Kate, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the Centre of London for inviting me to briefly speak to you today. As was said, I chair the Planning and Transportation Committee of the City of London Corporation, which is the governing body for the Square Mile. And I suppose my role and my committee's role is involving the safety and security of the city, its residents and workers, enjoying well-planned buildings, safe, attractive streets, and a great public transport system. And before today's in conversation with Janette and Andy, I just wanted to just say a few words about the work taking place in the city and the importance of the transport infrastructure within the Square Mile and how we are ensuring that it's fit for future use in these very uncertain times. To state the obvious, it's really the lifeblood of any city, the transport network, and it's responsible for moving so many people and goods in a safe, clean and efficient way. And we've got a resident population of around 8,000 residents, and that population swells to around 500,000 workers each day and around 10 million tourists throughout the year. So a large number of people are coming in and out of the city. And we believe the coming years will bring many changes for the city, both with resident and worker populations expected to rise. And not least the opening of the Elizabeth line, we anticipate will bring another 1.5 million people within 45 minutes of the city, increasingly drawn to our offer as a place to work and also increasingly as a 24/7 cultural destination. And therefore, our streets and transport system are a vital part of what makes the Square Mile a good place to work, also a place to live and visit, attracting businesses and workers from around the world, attracting that world-class talent, which Janette had just said we managed to procure with our transport providers and people like Andy and others. We are undertaking a large range of activities to ensure the city and its transport infrastructure are fit for the future. COVID-19 has clearly produced major challenges for all of us, not least in how we travel. And we've introduced a range of measures to support the recovery, ensuring people can feel confident in returning to the city safely and securely. And with our transport recovery plan, we're prioritising place for people to walk, ensuring that they can comfortably socially distance, and also giving more space for people to be able to choose to cycle. So the key measures, just by way of bullet points, are reallocating a large amount of space to walking and cycling, creating what we're calling pedestrian priority streets with limited access for motor vehicles, and we've closed some streets to through traffic except for buses and people and cycling. And we're also seeking, with Andy's help, to encourage the safe use of public transport. And of course, we should mention the fact that the Waterloo and City line is, of course, an important line for us, and we very much look forward to that being reopened as and when the metrics allow it. Our transport strategy, which has been under consultation and launched now, these changes I've just outlined are temporary, but they also importantly accelerate our delivery for a longer term ambition in the Square Mile that we have. And that transport strategy was adopted in May last year, which sets out a vision for 25 years of transport improvement in the city. And it's all about making the place healthier and more inclusive for all, making it people focused. This is closely aligned with Climate Action Strategy, which sets out our plan to make the Square Mile the world's greenest global financial centre. And that includes measures to prioritise walking, making streets safer and more accessible, and also just making our environment more pleasant, and using our street space more efficiently and smartly by reducing motor traffic, including delivery and servicing vehicles. Importantly, improving air quality, reducing noise, and encouraging the switch to zero emission capable vehicles. And in coinciding with this, we installed our first rapid electric vehicle charging points, and we're building on our strategy over the last few years. Examples which some of you will know about: Bank on Safety scheme, which improves safety and air quality by limiting traffic through that junction. And also, as part of that scheme, we made it permanent in 2018. We're now launching our All Change at Bank scheme, which aims to transform that iconic junction. It's important to say we're really enjoying working in partnership. These high quality streets and public spaces are a key part of the city's offer to residents, workers and visitors. And we are committed to delivering this very much at pace. They are only possible, though, by collaborating with partners and stakeholders, including the Mayor of London, TfL, our neighbouring boroughs, developers and a wide range of people, as well as residents and workers. And I very much look forward to working with you all to ensure that the London we bring back after this pandemic is and continues to be an even better world-leading location to live, work and visit. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now we'd like to welcome to the stage Janette Sadik-Khan.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Alistair, for your fantastic work in London. And I'm going to move to get this PowerPoint moving. So here we go. So it's great to be here with all of you after almost 10 years. And as you know, I was a transport commissioner under Mayor Bloomberg for 6.5 years. And we worked very hard to transform our streets from places just to park and drive cars into spaces for people. And that meant building 650 kilometers of bike lanes, over 60 plazas. We launched 7 rapid bus lines and the largest bike share program in North America, all while creating the safest streets and the lowest traffic fatalities in 100 years. And that also included turning Times Square into an urban oasis. Of course, everything changed when the coronavirus silenced our streets in March. And when you see a city street without people, like here in Times Square, it looks nothing like a city. Traffic in New York City plunged 94%, and transit ridership plunged 92%. And this was a scene that played out all around the world. In London, we saw traffic drop 76%, and scenes like this in Barcelona, in Milan, which was one of the first cities that was hit by the pandemic, and traffic plunged there some 75%. But when you think about it, in other ways, cities never really needed and did shut down. Essential workers still needed to get to their jobs. People still needed to shop for food and supplies. And the first thing that a lot of cities did to respond was to remake their streets. Like the pop-up bike lanes and the car-free streets created by Mayor Sadik-Khan. And TfL's Street Space program, which reclaimed lanes for buses and for Londoners to walk and to ride a bike. And you can see here in the square mile of London, the work that's been done there, thanks to the leadership of Alastair and Andy. And this is really part of a national effort. Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced a £2 billion national cycling strategy. And I think this strategy is of international significance because I think that the future of cities lies in car-free streets. And cycling isn't just, recreation or something that's a political statement. It's essential transportation, whether it's in times of prosperity or in times of the pandemic. And you can see it in Milan, where we helped Mayor Sala transform 34 kilometers of car space into safe space for people to walk or bike or take transit. And you've heard of the work that Mayor Hidalgo is doing, turning the Rue de Rivoli into a car-free corridor. And she's announced plans to create 650 kilometers of bike lanes and dozens of car-free spaces around schools, and has plans to remove half of the city's parking spaces. And of course, it wasn't just Europe. Mayor Lopez expanded cycling and pedestrian space within Bogota within weeks of the pandemic, as Tiffany, who's on our panel, knows. And while Auckland widened downtown sidewalks and built dedicated bike paths while the streets of Auckland were empty. More than 50 American cities have launched car-free streets, including over 80 kilometers in San Francisco. And cities are also reclaiming streets and parking spaces for restaurant seating, like here in Westminster. I mean, there's been a bit of a drop off, of course, with a recent spike in cases, but it does point the way forward. And it's a playbook for cities across Europe until we can reunite indoors. In New York City, 11,000 restaurants have been certified for outdoor dining, occupying 15,000 parking spaces and sidewalks. Hard to imagine. I can't imagine being transportation commissioner and taking away 15,000 parking spaces. It's a momentous time. And we've got all of these new spaces now for outdoor dining and activity, and people's imaginations for what their streets can be used for has really changed. And it's been a lifeline for both small businesses and for residents, not only in New York, but across the country. But this new outdoor city could change as abruptly as it appeared. And car traffic is almost back to pre-pandemic levels in London and is reoccupying city streets. And we're not going to be successful if we just bring traffic back to pre-COVID levels. That would be a colossal failure. We can bring back London and we can bring back all cities without bringing back the 1.3 million annual traffic deaths we have on roads around the world, without bringing back the 4.2 million deaths from pollution every year. We do not want to go back to what has been a broken status quo. This is the moment to rewrite the script. I chair an organization of transportation leaders from around the world, and London signed on to our core design principles. And we're working to ensure that we just don't revert back to the pre-pandemic status quo. And we've identified designs that cities can implement for a variety of activities, like using streets for outdoor learning and gymnasiums to voting. There's a big election in the United States today, and streets have played a huge role in accommodating thousands of voters safely and reducing the number of people crowding at indoor polling places. This guide has been accessed by over 100,000 people in 1,000 cities around the world. And this guidance can't come soon enough because the pandemic isn't over and winter is coming. And weatherproofing our streets will be a really big part of our recovery. London already has a history of weatherproof domes, and I think these could be the surprise hit of the season. Of course, it doesn't have to be domes. I mean, restaurants are already getting creative. And a street that's designed for winter is a new frontier that every city should be contemplating right now. And by turning our cities inside out and relocating as many activities, retail and social activities as possible, we may be able to weather this storm. But the biggest challenge to overcome may not be the change in season, but from fear. And there were a lot of headlines early in the pandemic that transit helped spread the coronavirus. And these headlines generated a lot of fear, but not a lot of insight. And with my colleague Seth Solomano, I wrote an article in The Atlantic looking at new research showing no connection between transit and coronavirus outbreaks in any city where it was studied. Meanwhile, when you think about it, Asian cities like Hong Kong have some of the highest levels of transit use, but they have fewer COVID cases than the entire state of Kansas. And people are scared of transit. But even scarier is a future where everyone drives. Before COVID, we faced global climate change. We faced millions of traffic deaths. We faced deaths from pollution. We simply cannot add a traffic crisis on top of a health, economic, and social crisis. We obviously have to win back riders, and there are some key starting points, showing visible cleaning protocols, messaging, and new norms for riding transit, like rear door boarding and touchless fare payment. That will all help. And masks will be just as ubiquitous as Oyster cards, just like commuters in Asia have used all along. There needs to be a national strategy, not just to restore, but to expand transit as an essential part of the recovery as people go back to work. Public transit doesn't exist in a vacuum. Ridership is a health and economic indicator and will reflect the realities of containing the virus and reopening our economies. We also need to look above ground to provide more options for getting people around. And London has already cracked the code on bikeable, walkable streets, like here on Orford Road, using streets not just for moving vehicles, but supporting people and supporting different uses. Looking at streets like Chisendale Road that could be changed overnight, making them work better for everyone, redesigned to accommodate people of every age and ability during any season. The road to recovery runs along our streets. And once you go down this road and you see what it can do for your city, there's no going back. The road reclamations happening here in London and around the world are not just emergency actions. They're strategies for a long-term economic recovery that won't just outlive the pandemic. They'll define the way cities look, feel, and function for decades to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Janette. The examples that you've shared of urban transformations worldwide really show how when there's political will, there is a way. And because active travel and public transport plays such a key role in a green and just recovery for cities, I am delighted to now welcome Andy Byford to this conversation. And the first question I have, Andy, it's been a big news story. Over the weekend, the Mayor of London and central government reached an agreement about future government support for TfL. Are you satisfied with the deal, and what might be on the table in 6 months' time when the negotiations resume?
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. Hi, Tiffany. Hi, Janette. Great to see you. And it's a very topical question. If you see bags under my eyes, it's because, yes, indeed, we did just do a deal. It was concluded, actually. It had to conclude by midnight. We concluded it with 14 minutes ago, 23:46. But the good news is we got a deal. And I think I'd characterize it as a fair deal. It's, when you're in discussions with government, you probably neither side's totally happy, but I think it's a fair deal. I think it gives us the funding that we need for the next 6 months. We were seeking £2 billion. We got a mechanism that will enable us to go up to around 1.8 million, potentially higher, if the revenue as a proxy, if you like, for ridership is less than what the modelling thought was predicated upon, and the modelling was predicated on 65% ridership. So my prediction is we'll be drawing down towards the higher end of that figure. There were some conditions against it. I think that's fair enough. We didn't expect a blank check, but now that TfL can move forward, we can push on with doing the work we were already doing to safely get people back riding transit again. We can push on with the green initiatives that we want to pursue, such as electrification of the bus fleet. We can push on with the street space program that Janette so eloquently just described. So there's lots to do. And the good news, one thing that really encouraged me, and credit to my boss, the Mayor of London, and the Secretary of State, included within that deal was a provision for an avenue, a roadmap, if you will, towards a longer term deal. That's what we need to get to. We don't need to be doing these 6-month standoff brinkmanship every 6 months. You can't run a transit system or a city like that. Let's make the case now for transport. That's my job. I'm looking now to get through the next 6 months and build a compelling way case for a long-term, stable, predictable and affordable income stream, not just based on fare box, because that's proven to be very vulnerable to events such as this, but a long-term funding plan where we can plan with confidence, deliver to our customers, redesign the places that Jeanette just described, and we can also secure contracts with our contract. The real prize, I'm just glad to have got through the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm. That is really encouraging. And one of the bigger issues for now and beyond 6 months is what is the right sort of funding model for a transport system in a global city like London? Is it sustainable to continue to heavily rely on passenger fares, or is there a better way? Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. Look, I kind of alluded to it in just concluding my last answer. This is an fare box recovery for TfL is over 70%. And in my last job as president of New York City Transit, that was the biggest agency within the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. The MTA has something like 38% of its revenue comes through the fare box. If I might cite another, it's around 49%. So that's the norm, around 30–40%. TfL has the fare box, and it's been forced to do that. Really, we're the only major transport undertaking really in the world, with the exception of Hong Kong, with a vastly different model. Really the only what you might call standard transportation system that doesn't receive any central grant for operating purposes. Now, in good times, we were able to cope, and it's credit to my predecessor, Mike Brown, previous Transport Commissioner, that £1 billion was taken off the cost base to get to a point of almost break even, which on day-to-day operating costs. But what the pandemic has shown is that you leave yourself dangerously exposed to unforeseen events or mega events such as this, where suddenly ridership falls off a cliff. Your income suffers a catastrophic, calamitous decline, and it shows that you've got to broaden your revenue base. So that's what we're aiming to now do. Move away from over-reliance on fare box recovery, because at the end, you can't cut your way out of these budget crises. And the worst thing you can do, by the way, is start slashing service. That's a slippery slope. The other slippery slopes don't go there. But equally, you can't just keep putting the fares up. After a little while, elasticities mean that you'll end up shooting yourself in the foot and people won't ride transport. So we need to broaden the fare base. We need to look at other revenue streams, sustainable, fair, equitable revenue streams that reflect the social benefit that transport represents. It's not just whether you ride transport. Some say, well, why should I pay for libraries? I don't have school kids. Well, to me, it's a social benefit. We didn't have to really grind to a halt. So whether you use it or whether you don't, it's a social benefit that needs to be properly funded, and it can't be recovery.
Mm-hmm. Right. And the Mayor of London has said that in 20 years' time, he wants 80% of journeys to be done.
Yeah, on transit. He wants 80% of journeys on public transport, on cycling and walking, 2041. That's a great vision. It's and you know what? Listening to Janette's intro, it is compelling. It certainly pressed a lot of my buttons. I'm a great believer that you can triumph. There's opportunity in adversity. In other words, just when you think, "God, this is terrible," our riderships collapse, etc., etc. What are we going to do? Well, there's always opportunities, and I think cities have a real golden opportunity now. So, not so long ago, people were saying it'll never happen. It'll never happen. You'll never get by 2041. We're around 60%. Suddenly, such a wacky proposition. People have really discovered the joys of cycling for all the joys of walking. Advertise public transport. So I want to see a fully electric bus fleet as soon as we possibly can. But you could have an all-electric bus fleet. It's still stuck in a traffic jam if you don't do something about congestion. So 24/7 bus lanes that are properly policed. It's music to my ears what about where she talked about 7 rapid bus lanes in proud of actually was with Janette's successor, Polly Schottenberg, now the NYC commissioner. We introduced a bus rapid transit along 14th Street. Suddenly customers are flocking back to it with some controls on through traffic and controls on cars. You make transport a compelling alternative, but plus safe provision of other alternatives such as cycling and walking. I had to go on an e-bike the other day. I'm a convert. How nice is that? You encounter a slight hill, the battery kicks in. Sign me up.
Janette, what role can cycling and micromobilities play in the future of active travel? As Andy's just said, it's really important that not only do we support public transport usage, but also make it safe for people to walk and cycle.
Well, I think that the mayor has stated some pretty ambitious and smart goals. You've got cycling 2% right now of commuters up, and he wants to get it up to 20% in 20 years. How do we do this in 5 years, right? How do we do this much faster? How do we turn this 2041 plan into a 2021 plan? And I think that's what's on the table right now. And I think it's really interesting what Andy pointed to. I think there's a misperception about why people bike. Some people bike because it's fun or healthy and good for the planet, but I've found that people like Andy and others are the reason they ride is because it's safe and it's reliable and it's a convenient option. And so, how do we continue to build on that and go from 2% to 20%? We have to look at what does a city look like when 1 in 5 people get around on a bike, right? That city looks like one where the infrastructure and bikes are prioritized on the street and it's not an afterthought, and to take a look at, to go a little further, we need to rethink how cities are also laid out. Not everybody works in the city center, and certainly the commuting patterns are changing, and cities need to be designed so that every neighborhood has its own center. And, New York and London are very similar in that they're both relatively flat. About 2/3 of trips are made on public transit, walking, and biking. About half of the trips in New York City are less than 3 miles. And in London, 2/3 of the trips are less than 3 miles. I mean, London can be one of the world's greatest cycling cities. And it may be a while before people get back onto public transit the way they used to, although with a leader like Andy Byford, it's only a matter of time. I personally am so upset that he's left. Our train daddy went to London and we are still crying about it, but we have to prepare and defend against the possibility of a car-focused recovery right now. And until public transit is restored and until we have a full recovery and full employment where everybody can take a bus or a tube, we need to rely on buses or 2 feet to get to where we need to go. And we can make this happen. Not everybody has to do it to have a huge effect. So as I mentioned in my presentation, it's not just London. Cycling was up 22% during the lockdown in Manchester during COVID. And their bike czar, Chris Boardman, has a £5 million cycling plan, to create a new wave of cycling, and has been a leader. I love the thing that he said to Parliament, which I'm starting to copy, which is, he said, pick a crisis and you'll probably find that cycling is the solution. So it's exciting to see what is happening in London and frankly in global capitals around the world.
Mm-hmm. And to your point about how cities have to do more to facilitate local journeys, one of the earlier changes that London put in place to manage the pandemic were low traffic neighborhoods. But as you may have seen in the media, there's been a lot of pushback, especially lately as people are feeling more fatigued with the second wave and a new lockdown coming up. So can I ask you both, where do you think we go from here? Janette, let's hear from you, and then Andy.
Well, I've seen some articles about the, controversy, a Guardian article that suggested there's some pushback, but I think there's also broad support for low traffic neighborhoods. I have some background in this arena. I wrote a book with my colleague Seth Solomano called Streetfight. And if there was a subtitle, it would be that if you push the status quo pushes back hard. But from what I've seen, and I have to underscore that I'm not, seeing the day-to-day, so I don't mean to be glib about this, but I think we can look beyond the low-grade controversy about low traffic neighborhoods. There's nothing that I've seen installed here that can't be adjusted or revised. And, it's never too late for TfL and other cities and towns to go back to neighborhoods and explain, what they've done and to share the data that they've collected and adjust their programs. So I think there are a lot of anecdotes about changes to the street. You can kind of set your watch by communities saying it wasn't enough community outreach, or it's unsafe, or shops can't get deliveries. People say that the changes cause traffic, which makes the streets unsafe and created pollution. I'm seeing the same arguments made that we saw, in the US. And, in New York City, as Andy knows, if you read the papers, you would think that New York City DOT under Mike Bloomberg was killing the city. It was headline news and tabloids and politicians. They all ran against the bus lanes and the bike lanes and the plazas. But it turned out a lot of people were way ahead of the press and the politicians. And in the last poll taken at the end of the Bloomberg administration, there was 73% of New Yorkers supported bike share, 72% of New Yorkers supported the plazas, 64% approved the bike lanes. And so even at that fractured environment at the time, this would have been considered a landslide. So the lesson here is not that every low traffic neighborhood works, but it's now time to try things and evaluate them. And there may be pushback, but we have to separate legitimate operational and safety questions from NIMBYism, not in my backyard.
Mm-hmm. Andy, what do you think?
Sure. I'll just pick up there. I entirely agree. And I think the trouble is people are too quick sometimes to write off any change at all. So we've certainly seen that here in London with the low traffic neighborhoods. In some cases, there's been an almost immediate clamor to take them out before they've really had the chance to even prove themselves. So obviously you've got to get the design right. They were put in reasonably quickly. We had an expedited arrangement to design with boroughs, and typically we provide the expertise, but the boroughs do the assessments. And in many cases, they've been extremely successful. In some, they've needed to be tweaked, and in a handful, they've needed to actually be withdrawn. But let's not just knee-jerk and forget what it used to be like before we've even given these things a chance. There are huge benefits in low traffic neighborhoods in terms of the overall Vision Zero context. And again, going back to my 14th Street example, if I may, I remember the voices of doom, the sirens of doom, Scylla and Charybdis, saying it's going to be an absolute disaster. Traffic will absolutely ruin 13th Street and 15th Street. And no one's going to use these buses, etc., etc. Polly and I, Janet's successor, held our nerve, same as Janette did in Mike Bloomberg's time. We held our nerve. We implemented properly. I would say ignored the criticism, but we dealt with the criticism. We tackled the issue head on. We made sure we planned with infinite detail to make sure that it was properly executed on the day. And hey, guess what? All the key measures, average journey speed, average journey time end to end, ridership, all went in the right direction. So if you plan things properly, whether they be on public transport or on safe neighborhoods and low traffic neighborhoods, do your homework, communicate the hell out of it, make sure people understand why you're doing something and what the benefits are, and then be prepared to be flexible. I think you can make the case and you can stare down the naysayers.
Mm-hmm. Low traffic neighborhoods certainly can help play a part in creating safer environments for people to cycle more. But in both New York and London and many other global cities, there are gender, race, and socioeconomic disparities in cycling. There are also perceptions that cycling is mainly for middle-class white people, in particular mammals, the middle-aged men in Lycra, and that cycling isn't really practical for people with long commutes or people with low-wage jobs. Janette, what can transport planners and decision makers do to address these inequalities in cycling and make it more inclusive?
It's a great question, and it's a question that cities are wrestling with right now, particularly in this moment of the pandemic. But I think there's a misperception about the preponderance of these mammals. You know, I mean, I've seen the morning commute over the Blackfriars Bridge, and, you know, that seems like a salmon run, you know, and it also looked like a session of the UN General Assembly. You know, there's like people from all backgrounds, you know, all shapes, sizes, black, white, you know, it's a huge mix. And it's the same in New York City. I mean, sure, there are riders that are out there wearing Lycra and looking like they're doing the, you know, Tour de France, going over the Williamsburg Bridge, as, you know, Andy knows. But, you know, when I ride, you know, I see a lot of New Yorkers that look like, you know, the same ones that you'd see on the subway, you know, black and white and old and young, you know, and they're wearing expensive gear or just wearing jeans, you know, and they're heading to work or have some other plans. And I think if you look at a street, though, and the only people you see on it are men in Lycra, I think there's a problem with the street itself. Right? Women are really the indicator species of the health of a street. And if they don't feel safe in the lanes and you don't see women and children out there, there are a lot of other things going wrong. And their absence from the street is really telling you something important. And we need to view that in our planning, which we don't always do. We need the view from women in the street, and we need the view from the women in charge. And when you see women on the street biking, you know that's a safe street. And when you see them with their children, you know that you are actually changing the culture. And so I really think we shouldn't generalize about who rides, you know, what the stereotypes are. We can't just focus on the guy with the brightest jersey, you know, just as we shouldn't focus on the loudest, you know, controversies are, and lose sight of the big picture. You know, we did a study in New York under Mayor Bloomberg, and we found that districts with the highest percentage of bike commuters were not what we think of as, you know, the wealthier neighborhoods. They were in Harlem. And this made sense because this is inexpensive transportation. And a lot of people work odd hours, you know, in neighborhoods that aren't directly connected by public transport. And it could be a 30-minute trip, you know, or more. And so we intentionally viewed bike accessibility as an equity issue. And we targeted those neighborhoods for bike infrastructure. And we cited our bike share stations. You know, we launched the biggest bike share system, you know, in North America, and we provided steep discounts to encourage people to sign up for membership. So we built, you know, 650 kilometers of infrastructure to make it safe. We put parking protected bike paths out there to, you know, really lock in those changes. And, you know, I think women are growing at a faster rate in New York City than men in recent years. And I think it's a direct it's directly related to the safe infrastructure that's there. So I think we need to change the lens of how we plan and what we put in the street.
Mm-hmm. And are there any measures that TfL are doing to try and diversify cycling and sustain the growth we've seen in cycling over the past few months?
Sure. I mean, the main thing we're and I speak, by the way, as a white middle-aged man, but I don't wear Lycra, just for the record.
That's good to know.
Yes, well, certainly not when I'm riding a bike, okay? what we're trying to do is make it part of the normal offer, just part of the transport offer. So, yeah, if you want to take the tube, take a tube, take a bus, nice and easy, Oyster card, really simple, turn up and go. So we're trying to make cycling a very similar kind of experience. So it can be turn up and go. So you can sign up for the Santander app. I've done that. It's really easy to then go to a docking station. We've located them all across the city. It's really quick. You can just tap on the reader. You can use your app, and you're good to go. That plus access to increasing numbers of dedicated, safe, segregated bike lanes where you don't feel that you're in the Tour de France, not just with what you're wearing, but because you're having to steam along with trucks and buses, which can be quite a scary experience. In your own lane, yeah, sure, you still see the sort of keeners, the professional cyclists, but increasingly, I agree with Janette, increasingly, you're seeing just regular people who get the almost the liberation of cycling and the joys of being able to go under your own steam and pick a bike up from outside your apartment building, drop it off maybe outside your workplace. So I think that's the main thing that we're doing, making sure that it's easy to use, that it's cheap to use, that it's prevalent, that there's lots of good intel. We've just launched the new app, the TfL Go app, which makes it really easy to figure out whichever mode you want to use. But seeing as we're talking about cycling, you can see where the docking stations are. You can see how many bikes there are when you want to go and pick one up. And when you want to go and dock one, you can avoid that annoying situation where there's nowhere to dock because it'll tell you if there's any free spaces. So that's the way to do it. Make it easy, make it part of the regular transport offer.
Mm-hmm. We are nearing the close of this session, and one thing that's come up in the chat box from the audience is congestion charging. And I just wanted to ask both of you if road user charging is inevitable and what sort of scheme would be appropriate. It looks like for now, the congestion charge zone in London will not be extended. But I think in New York by 2022, or correct me if it's a different year, Janette, but congestion charging is coming to New York. So what are both of your thoughts? Let's hear from Andy first.
Sure. Well, I remember I lived here in London when the original congestion charge came in. And back to those voices of doom. Everyone said it won't work. People will cover their license plates. The cameras won't work. People will just pay the fine, or not the fine, pay the charge, and it'll be the first few days of that scheme coming into action. The traffic levels dropped dramatically, but the key point, the sweet spot, was achieved in that you don't want so many people to be put off that you don't raise any revenue, which is ring-fenced for transit improvements. But equally, you want enough people to not want to pay the charge in order to create clearer spaces for public transport to be able to get through and buses to become a more compelling proposition. So that's how you do it, a win-win. So no, you're absolutely right. Under the deal that we just struck with government, the congestion it's the changes to the congestion zone that we agreed in terms of the times of its operation will stay in place for now. There's no expansion for now. Should we look at road user charging? Look, I've gone on the record as saying we need to look at all possible equitable, sustainable and affordable measures. And certainly I think road user charging is part of that mix. Obviously, there's politics and there's political courage required around that type of decision. But I'm interested in anything that gives TfL a long-term, predictable, sustainable revenue stream, and that has environmental benefits and direct benefits for transport. So certainly that's one of the options that I'm very interested in.
Janette?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. We need to have stable, dedicated funding for transit. It's never going to get funded just through the fare boxes. Andy mentioned, in the Transit Authority in New York City, it's 50% fare ratio recovery. And so that's not enough. And, we've always needed, federal, state, and local resources to keep the lights on, just to keep the lights on, forget about even expansion. And, we're going to have a low ridership for a while. We've got a lot of deficits that need to be covered, and it's way beyond the ability of the fare box or even a city's ability to recover on its own. So we need to do as much as we can to find dedicated revenue sources. And what we've seen in the United States is that local transit ballot measures pass by overwhelming majorities because people understand the benefits of transit. And again, once that message is done well, which Andy articulated the reasons why everybody benefits from transit and not just the people who ride transit, that's really effective. And transit should never be politicized. MTA carried 9 million people a day pre-COVID, and that's 9 million Americans. And it's not just like any 9 million Americans. It's New York City is the core of the national economy. It's 11% of our national GDP. And so we have to continue to find dedicated revenue sources to keep this essential lifeline going. And I think congestion pricing, although we need to rename it, congestion and pricing are two deeply unpopular ideas. Right? Like nobody likes congestion and nobody wants pricing. So, I think, fair deal and that kind of language is really important. And I think we need to pay attention to our messaging on this to get the support that we need to get these essential dedicated sources passed and in place for transit agencies, not only in New York City and London, but around the world.
Messaging definitely is key for promoting walking, cycling, and public transport usage. We are out of time for this session. It's been really great to hear really inspiring examples of how our city streets and public spaces can look different from Janette. And I trust that London is in excellent hands with Andy, the former train daddy of New York. And yeah, thank you both for sharing your time and insights. And thank you to the Centre for London for bringing together these two great speakers. And thank you to our audience. There's been a very lively chat. And I think this is to be continued. There's still a lot to happen with cycling, walking, and public transport, and TfL's future funding situation is still evolving. So I'm sure that Centre for London will be picking up on these points. And thank you all for coming. This has been a really great event.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. Good to see you.
All of you. Thanks to all of our wonderful speakers this evening. Thanks also to the sponsors of London Conference. The major sponsors, Corporation of the City of London, L&Q and Uber. Supporting sponsors, London Councils, London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera and Trust for London, and exhibitors, Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. And I will just put in a plug again for Janette and Seth Salamano's book, Streetfight Handbook for an Urban Revolution, which I misnamed earlier, but it's fantastic, much passed around the Centre for London office. And there's a link to that in our Twitter as well. We've got a really extensive program of work around the future of transport and mobility, which you can find at centreforlondon.org. And we're holding a little Zoom networking event after this. The instructions on how to join that are in your joining email from this morning. As a British American, I'd like to wish all my fellow Americans out there watching good luck in keeping their hearts from jumping out of their bodies while we follow the US presidential election tonight and tomorrow. But on that note, our first session tomorrow morning should be really fascinating in light of the US election. It's with Audrey Tang, the digital minister for Taiwan. She's a specialist in using technology to promote trust between government and citizens instead of what technology is usually used for. So she's going to be interviewed by former FT journalist James Crabtree, who's located in Singapore. Should be really, really interesting. So that starts 10:15 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you again, everybody, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks.
Thanks.